The 2025 college football season is in full go. People are losing jobs, coaches are being shuffled around, and the top dogs are making themselves known. But there is one team who, out of nowhere, arose from the absolute pits of college football hell. A team who didn't just become irrelevant, but became something you'd only see out of the strongest dynasties football has given us seemingly overnight. And that is Indiana, or what they should be more known as Windiana. But to truly understand the most insane transformation of a team we have ever seen, we have got to go back. But if you're a guy like me that wants to take really good care of his health but is just constantly busy, you're going to love today's sponsor, Grüns. Guys, I'm gonna be so honest. This is a life-saving product when it comes to getting the nutrition you need in a convenient package. They aren't a multivitamin, they aren't a greens gummy, and they aren't a probiotic. They are all three in one convenient little setup, and only for a fraction of the cost of what it would be to buy all three of those separately. On top of that, the thing that I love that really drew me in is they are scientifically backed. In 2025, they did a double-blind placebo-controlled study on Grüns and found that they had a 20% increase in folate levels, 40% increase in vitamin C levels in the blood, not to mention these fun little bears are delicious to eat. Watch this, one take. And I believe in it so much that right now, if you click the link down in the description, you are going to get 52% off your first order. Guys, I'm being so serious. 52% just by clicking that link. So go to Grüns, try it, check out the science too while you're there. You're going to love it, and thank me later. Let's find a good jumping off point, which was Indiana's last time being ranked. The year is 2020 and they're coming off a really promising season under head coach Tom Allen, where they went 8-5, and believe it or not, this was their first time being above 500 in over a decade, and finally it looked like they were about to turn the corner, as no coach here could find consistent success after Bill Mallory left in the 80s. In fact, they couldn't just not find success, but every eventual climb out of the depths of being in the Big Ten somehow always ended up with a ridiculous fall from grace, like Kevin Wilson's 1-11 season in 2011. But in 2020, Indiana looked like the real deal. They opened up the season taking on a top 10 ranked Penn State team and winning. Then they would beat Rutgers by 16 points, and oh my god, they beat a top 25 Michigan team by 17 points before shutting out Michigan State, and holy crap, their fate was even in their hands against number 3 Ohio State. After starting the game down 35-7, they ended with the ball 37 seconds left, down by a score. And although they lost that, they ended up beating Maryland handedly and even taking on another top 25 team in Wisconsin and pulling off a huge win. I mean, I know this was a shorter season, but 4 of their 7 teams were in the top 25, and they won 3 out of 4 of those games, which if you would have told the 2019 squad that who had 4 top 25 games where they lost all of them, they would be blown away. So surely this young quarterback named Michael Penix Jr. would be able to carry. Oh my god. We didn't even get a hot start to get our hopes up. Not even a little 3 or 4 game win streak to make us think we had a chance, as Iowa opened us up by crushing us 34-6, then Cincinnati would win by 14, and Penn State would shut us out. And despite picking up a win over Idaho and Western Kentucky in the first 4 weeks, Indiana would lose out. Yeah, the Penix injury hurt, but was he really gonna help them race Ohio State, who put up 54 in the game? And in 2022, he would transfer out to Washington, so now they don't even have him. So after starting off 3-0, requiring an overtime win against Western Kentucky, they would just get swamped. 7 straight losses while getting blown out by anybody in the top 25 before being able to sneak out a cheeky double overtime win against Michigan State before Purdue would come in and end their season a depressingly expected 4-8, and things would just get worse from here. 2023, they would open up with a 23-3 loss to Ohio State, which would be the one bright spot in the season before beating an FCS opponent and then losing to Louisville and having to take a pretty bad Akron team to 4 overtimes to win, and that was the good half of their season. From then on, Maryland, Michigan, and Rutgers all took turns beating the crap out of them before they were able to at least keep it close with Penn State, which seemed enough to inspire them to pull off a win over Wisconsin before losing out, falling down to 3-9 from just being ranked 4 years ago. Now, Indiana had no choice, and it was time to bring in another head coach. But who could possibly turn this ship around? Well, to answer your question, we have to go to the FCS realms. At the same time, we started this video off with Indiana because a man by the name of Curt Signetti had just taken over a team who had suffered a losing streak for not 1, not 2, not 3, but 6 consecutive seasons in Elon. And in year 1 with Curt, he not only took them to the playoffs with a completely turned around 8-3 record, but had them ranked nationally in the top 25, which was something that hadn't happened for them in the 21st century. And the following year, while facing a much harder schedule and it appeared to hurt their overall record, the team still finished in the top 20 and even knocked off number 2 James Madison, who was so impressed by Elon's turnaround that they hired Signetti the year after. And while James Madison wasn't bad by any stretch of the imagination, when he took over, he would take them to heights they'd never imagined. Not just almost upsetting West Virginia, but taking them to a 14-2 season his first year there. And he wasn't just one of the few teams that couldn't just handle, but he would dominate the COVID season by making it to the semifinals of the college football playoffs. But in 2022, he would do one of the most impressive feats that you can as a head coach by navigating the jump from FCS to FBS, where JMU would not miss a beat. They would finish that season 8-3, only to not go bowling because of the weird stipulation that you can't go bowling after changing a division. But what was even more impressive for the Dukes, as they were just an overtime stop away from going entirely undefeated in their regular season with an impressive ACC win over the Virginia Cavaliers. So naturally, a coach who could do all of that was absolutely in the conversation to take over at Indiana. But I don't think anybody was ready for what he would do once he got the keys to the kingdom. He would take this team filled with players who hadn't known a winning season since they had been there and immediately flip the culture on his head. Their week 1 opponent in FIU wouldn't know what was coming as the Hoosiers would stomp them. Then Western Illinois, who knew that they were playing out of their league in an FBS-FCS matchup, got a rude awakening of a 77-3 shellacking, as I'm sure they didn't think they were that outclassed. But Indiana would keep rolling. UCLA would get dominated in their first conference win of the year. Charlotte would get obliterated as a nice home treat for the fans before they would delve into probably the most dominant conference play that Indiana fans had ever seen. Maryland would get the axe with a decisive 14-point victory before Northwestern would fall in a once again strong 17-point win. But their real test would come against Nebraska, who was coming into this game 5-1 and had all the tools to be, oh my god, Indiana beat them by 49 points. I mean, they absolutely all over them for 4 quarters, and Washington would put up a better performance but still lose by 14 before Michigan State would get completely obliterated under the weight of a 37-point blowout. This would lead to their hardest 2-game stretch, which was a Michigan team who was finally starting to get their rhythm, but Indiana just proved that they could play both ways as Michigan took their offense down to the dirt, but the Hoosiers were ready for that mud wrestle, wriggling out a 5-point win as they turned their eyes to their best competition, a fiery, red-hot Ohio State team. And through the first quarter, I'll be damned, Indiana had the lead, but luck wasn't on their side. The quarterback would fumble the ball away, and even though they'd get back the ensuing punt, they would also be fumbled at the 7-yard line to give the Buckeyes a 7-point lead going into half. And from there, the game would just get away from them. But while this would be a talking point to talk about how Indiana was fraudulent and they hadn't really played anybody of note and that they shouldn't even be in the playoffs, when we look back to the end of the season, we might see a very different picture, so stick with it. But the following week, things did not look much better for them, as Ohio State would go on to lose to Michigan, albeit a Michigan team that we just saw Indiana beat, while Indiana was trying to prove a point against Purdue by dropping a 66-0 skunking right on the head of the Boilermakers. But with that, Indiana would be able to sneak into the playoffs as the 10th seed and have to play against Notre Dame, where, don't let the final score deceive you, it wasn't even that close. The first half ended 17-3 as Indiana seemed to just run out of offensive firepower, and Notre Dame, despite not moving the ball particularly easy, was able to get a huge 98-yard touchdown and follow that up with a 16-play, 83-yard touchdown drive, while Indiana didn't score a bulk of their points until it was entirely too late in the game, where they had 14 points in the final 4 minutes. So this just fueled narratives. Indiana was overrated, real teams like Ohio State and Notre Dame were dominating them, and they were frauds. But then something changed. Ohio State and Notre Dame for the entire tournament dominated, well, everybody, and ended up playing each other in the national championship. And while that should have changed our conversation about Indiana, instead people just kind of let them hold that embarrassing L until proven otherwise, which seemed to piss off Curt Signetti specifically. Because after that season, there was a ton of turnover. Their starting quarterback left for the draft, 2 senior running backs were gone, and they had a lot of making up to do, which is why he would come back in the 2025 season and pull off a 13-point win against Old Dominion. Alright, not exactly breaking records, but then against a much better than the previous year Kennesaw State, they would be sending a message as they crushed them 56-9. And then they'd move on to demolish Indiana State with a 73-0 beating before having to face their real match, a top 10 Illinois, which I'm sure they felt disrespected about. I mean, Indiana finished higher than them last year, started off stronger than them this year, and despite entering this game as a 4.5-point favorite, they still were ranked at 19 while Indiana got to sit 10 spots ahead of them. So what did they do except set football history, which is the biggest beating of a top 10 team by a team outside of the top 10 as they crushed them in a 53-point victory. It was Fighting Illini's fans' worst nightmare come true. They were completely shut out in the second half, while the Hoosiers were averaging more points than they'd put up the entire game every single quarter. This would immediately put college football on high alert as Iowa would come into town and once again prove that Indiana could dance in the grindy, low-ground affair that the Big Ten West often gives us, as they even ended that game with a gorgeous, intentional safety from the 40-yard line, which, I mean, man, there's not a cooler way to win a game of football. But maybe those teams were frauds. I mean, Iowa could be here or there. Illinois did have a good win against USC, but we couldn't be sure about either one of those. But the team we knew was good was Oregon, the next team on Indiana's schedule. They were the number 1 team last year, had already knocked off number 3 Penn State, and were currently taking the 3rd spot in the league. But it was time for Indiana to make their ultimate statement. Through 4 gritty quarters of play, they were able to overcome even their own most critical mistakes as they threw a pick 6 in the 4th quarter to do the second most gangster thing I've ever seen, which is take a knee without ending the game as they gave the ball back to Oregon with 32 seconds left, up by only 10 points, essentially saying, yeah, we know we have this in the bag. And while 3 wins against top 25 teams in a row may have been what they could have only hoped for a couple years ago, what they did against their non-top 25 opponents was the thing of dreams. Michigan State, despite being on a slide, would most certainly not get off that slide as they would take a 25-point ass kicking to the face. But UCLA, a team who was hot, that everybody thought was turning the corner with a big win against Penn State and then winning 2 more games back-to-back to the surprise of the entire country, would then get shot back to reality as Indiana slapped their taste buds out of their mouth with a 50-point win as they crushed their Cinderella story before it even got to be a thing. And then when facing down Maryland, who had just lost to UCLA, they would once again do the same thing, crushing them under the weight of a 55-point victory before they faced their ultimate test. Now, I know Penn State had seen better days. They had embarrassingly close losses and were in the middle of a 5-game slide, but that doesn't mean that they were suddenly a bad team overnight. And for 3.5 quarters, we were reminded of this as they had the lead with under 2 minutes left in the game. But But this is where we would see the final nail in the coffin for just how good the Hoosiers were. On a final drive that opened up with a sack, through a combination of some of the best passes you've ever seen and some miraculous catches, Mendoza would traverse the length of the field, throwing balls only where his receivers could catch it, while those same receivers were making some of the most acrobatic catches you could imagine. And I truly believe that Penn State could not have played better defense here if you wanted. You couldn't force a pitch and catch to be more perfect than what it was on this final drive. But that was the difference. As in the end, when Mendoza threw a ball into the tightest window in the back of the end zone, it became clear that we weren't witnessing a hot streak, but we were witnessing the start of a new dynasty, the dynasty of Windiana.